Imagine strapping yourself into a metal tube with a rocket engine powerful enough to turn you into a shooting star. No ejection seat that works above 120,000 feet. No second chances. Just you, the controls, and the thin line between Earth's atmosphere and the infinite black void of space. August 22, 1963. Joe Walker sits in the cockpit of the X-15, suspended beneath a modified B-52 bomber at 45,000 feet. In minutes, he'll push this experimental rocket plane to 354,200 feet, that's 67 miles straight up. Higher than anyone has ever flown before, fast enough to cross from Los Angeles to New York in less than an hour. But here's what makes this absolutely insane. The X-15 wasn't designed by computers. No advanced simulations. No AI calculations. Just slide rules, pencils, and engineers willing to bet a pilot's life on their math. This is the story of the most dangerous aircraft ever built, and the 12 men who rode it to the edge of space. The year is 1954, and America has a problem. The sound barrier had been broken 7 years earlier by Chuck Yeager, but aviation engineers were hitting a wall literally. Planes kept disintegrating when they pushed too fast, too high. Metal would heat up like a frying pan. Control surfaces would stop working in the thin air. Pilots would black out from the G-forces. The U.S. Air Force, NASA's predecessor NACA, and the Navy came together with a wild idea. Forget about making a plane that could take off and land normally. Instead, build something so radical, so extreme, that it could only fly for a few minutes at a time. A manned missile. They called it the X-15. North American Aviation got the contract, and their engineers faced challenges that seemed impossible. How do you build something that can survive temperatures of 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit? How do you control an aircraft in space where there is no air for the control surfaces to push against? How do you bring a pilot home alive after he's been traveling at nearly a mile per second? The solution was a machine that looked like it came from a science fiction movie. 67,000 pounds of thrust from a rocket engine that burned ammonia and liquid oxygen. A frame made from a titanium-chromium alloy called Inconel-X that could withstand the heat of re-entry. And here is the genius part. Tiny hydrogen peroxide rockets mounted on the nose and wings that could turn the aircraft in the vacuum of space. But the real innovation was the philosophy behind it. The X-15 wasn't meant to be a practical aircraft. It was a research platform. Every flight would gather data that would eventually lead to the space shuttle, to re-entry technology, to understanding what the human body could endure at the very edge of survival. The first pilot selected was Scott Crossfield, a civilian test pilot and engineer who had helped design the aircraft. When he first saw the completed X-15 in 1958, he said it looked like a black telephone pole with stubby wings. He wasn't wrong. The thing was basically a flying fuel tank with a cockpit. June 8, 1959. The first powered flight, Crossfield was dropped from the B-52 mothership at 37,000 feet. The moment he ignited that rocket engine, he was slammed back into his seat with a force that made his vision blur. The X-15 accelerated like nothing he'd ever experienced. But then something went wrong. The engine exploded. Not catastrophically, not yet, but enough that Crossfield had to make an emergency landing. He brought the wounded aircraft down on the dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base. And when the engineers examined the damage, they found the entire rear section of the fuselage buckled and broken. This was just the beginning. Over the next few months, the X-15 program would become a masterclass in controlled chaos. The aircraft was so far beyond anything that had been built before that every flight revealed new problems. The canopy would frost over at high altitude, leaving pilots flying blind. The rocket engine would shut down unexpectedly. The landing gear would fail, and then there was the speed. When you are traveling at Mach 5 times the speed of sound, things stop behaving the way you'd expect. The air itself becomes a weapon. Shockwaves form around the aircraft that can tear it apart. The friction generates heat that turns metal into putty. Your reaction time becomes meaningless because by the time your brain processes what's happening, you've already traveled 2 miles. The pilots had to learn a completely new way of flying. Conventional aircraft controls were useless above 100,000 feet. Instead, they had to use those reaction control thrusters, essentially becoming spacecraft pilots before spacecraft existed. They trained in simulators, but simulation could only teach you so much. At some point, you had to strap in and hope your training was enough. Neil Armstrong, yes, that Neil Armstrong was one of the 12 pilots selected for the program. Years before he walked on the moon, he was flying the X-15, and he learned firsthand just how unforgiving it could be. On April 20th, 1962, Armstrong was coming back from a high-altitude flight when he made a slight miscalculation. Instead of landing at Edwards, he skipped off the atmosphere like a stone across water and sailed 30 miles south, over the Rose Bowl Stadium in Pasadena. He barely made it back to the lake bed. It was the kind of mistake that in any other aircraft would have been embarrassing. In the X-15, it could have been fatal. But despite the dangers, despite the crashes and close calls, the X-15 kept pushing higher and faster. Enter Joe Walker. Walker was NASA's chief test pilot, a veteran of over 50 research aircraft programs. Quiet, methodical, absolutely fearless. While other pilots treated the X-15 with a healthy dose of respect and fear, Walker saw it as a challenge. He wanted to know exactly how far this machine could go. By 1963, the X-15 had already exceeded Mach 6 minus 4,520 miles per hour. At that speed, you're not flying through air anymore. You're punching through it, creating a wall of superheated plasma in front of you. The cockpit windows would glow orange from the heat. The metal skin of the aircraft would expand and contract so much that panels would buckle. Walker had already set altitude records, reaching over 246,000 feet in April of 1963. But he knew the X-15 had more to give. August 22, 1963. Flight 91. The mission plan was straightforward on paper. Climb to maximum altitude using a modified flight profile that would trade some speed for height. In reality, it meant pushing the X-15 into a region of the atmosphere where the flight manual was blank. Nobody knew what would happen. Walker climbed into the cockpit before dawn. The pre-flight checks took hours. Every system had to be perfect because there would be no second chances. The X-15 didn't glide well, it dropped like a brick when the engine shut down. You had one shot at landing, and if you missed the lake bed, you were probably dead. At 8 o'clock a.m., the B-52 took off with the X-15 nestled under its wing like a baby bird. They climbed to 45,000 feet and flew to the launch point over Nevada. Walker ran through his checklist one final time, then radioed, "Ready for launch, 3, 2, 1, drop." The X-15 fell away from the bomber, and for 2 seconds Walker was in free fall. Then he hit the ignition switch. The rocket engine roared to life with 57,000 pounds of thrust, and Walker was crushed back into his seat as the aircraft accelerated almost straight up. Within seconds, he passed Mach 1, then Mach 2. The G-forces built until he could barely move his arms. At 40 seconds into the flight, he was doing Mach 5 and climbing through 100,000 feet. The sky outside his window was turning from blue to purple to black. Stars were becoming visible in the middle of the day. 1 minute in, he passed 200,000 feet. The air was so thin now that the conventional controls were useless. Walker switched to the reaction control system, using tiny bursts from the hydrogen peroxide thrusters to keep the aircraft stable. Then, at 90 seconds, the engine shut down as planned. He was out of fuel. But momentum carried him upward, higher and higher, as the X-15 arced over the top of its trajectory. Walker looked at his instruments. 300,000 feet, 325,000, 350,000, and then 354,200 feet. 67 miles above the surface of the Earth. Officially, space begins at 62 miles. The line. Walker had crossed it. He was an astronaut. For nearly 2 minutes, Joe Walker floated in his cockpit, essentially in orbit, looking down at a curved Earth below him. He could see the entire state of Nevada spread out like a map. The curvature of the planet was obvious. Above him, the black of space stretched away forever, dotted with stars that didn't twinkle because there was no atmosphere to distort their light. But there was no time to sightsee. The X-15 was already beginning to fall, and when you're falling from 67 miles up, things happen fast. Re-entry was the most dangerous part of any flight. The X-15 would hit the thicker atmosphere at hypersonic speeds, and all that kinetic energy would convert to heat, the skin temperature would spike above 1,200 degrees. If the angle of attack was too steep, the aircraft would burn up. Too shallow, and it would skip back into space and never return. Walker oriented the X-15 using the reaction controls, pointing the nose down at a precise angle. Then he waited as gravity took hold. The first hint of atmosphere came as a gentle buffeting. Then it built. The G-forces reversed, pushing him forward in his straps as the air resistance slowed the aircraft. The glow started orange. Light creeping across the windscreen as friction heated the air to thousands of degrees. The temperature gauges climbed 800 degrees, 1,000, 1,100. The entire aircraft was groaning under the stress, metal expanding and contracting, rivets popping. Walker could hear every sound, feel every vibration. This was the moment when the X-15 would either hold together or tear itself apart. But the engineers had done their math right. The inconel X skin held, the internal structure stayed intact. At 80,000 feet, the air was thick enough for the conventional controls to start working again. Walker switched off the reaction system and grabbed the stick. Now came the landing. The X-15 glided like a brick with wings, which is to say it didn't glide at all. It fell at a 22-degree angle, dropping at 300 feet per second. Walker had one chance to line up with the dry lake bed at Edwards. Too short and he'd crash in the desert. Too long and he'd overshoot and run out of room. He brought the X-15 down in a sweeping arc, the nose high, bleeding off speed. The lake bed rushed up. At 200 miles per hour, he deployed the landing skids. The X-15 hit hard, bounced once, then settled onto the dirt in a cloud of dust. Walker had just flown higher than any aircraft before or since. He'd reached the edge of space and come back alive. But the X-15 program wasn't all triumph. November 15, 1967. Mike Adams was flying Flight 191, a high-altitude mission that should have been routine. Adams was one of the newer pilots, eager to prove himself. He'd trained extensively, but training could never fully prepare you for the X-15. Something went wrong during re-entry. The aircraft began spinning. Adams fought the controls, but at hypersonic speeds, the X-15 was unforgiving. The spin accelerated, G-forces built. The aircraft broke apart at 65,000 feet. Mike Adams never had a chance. He became the only pilot killed in the X-15 program, but his death highlighted just how close to the edge every flight had been. The X-15 had made 199 flights over 9 years. That one of those flights ended in tragedy was almost miraculous. It could have been so much worse. The program pushed boundaries that seemed impossible. Pilots routinely flew at speeds and altitudes that today's astronauts reach only briefly. The data gathered from those flights informed the design of the Space Shuttle, the Mercury and Gemini programs, and modern re-entry systems. Joe Walker never got to see the full legacy of what he'd accomplished. In 1966, he was killed in a mid-air collision while flying a different aircraft, an F-104, as a chase plane. For the XB-70 bomber, he died doing what he loved, but the world lost one of the greatest test pilots who ever lived. The X-15 program ended in 1968. The last flight was in October, and then this incredible aircraft was retired to museums. You can see them today, one at the Smithsonian, another at the Air Force Museum in Ohio. They look small and fragile up close, nothing like the monsters they were in the air. But the legacy lives on. Every spacecraft that re-enters Earth's atmosphere uses lessons learned from the X-15, the control systems, the heat-resistant materials. The understanding of hypersonic flight, all of it came from 12 men willing to strap themselves into a rocket and see what happened. Think about that for a moment. In 1963, Joe Walker flew to 354,200 feet in an aircraft designed with slide rules. No computers, no GPS, no satellite communications. Just raw engineering, raw courage, and a willingness to push the absolute limits of what was possible. The X-15 flew at Mach 6.7 - 4,520 miles per hour. That record stood for decades. Even today, very few aircraft can match that speed, and none can do it with a human pilot experiencing every second of it. The program proved that humans could survive in space, could control a vehicle at hypersonic speeds, could re-enter the atmosphere without burning up. It paved the way for everything that came after Apollo, the Space Shuttle, SpaceX, all of it. But more than the technology, the X-15 represented something profound about human nature. It showed that when you give talented, dedicated people an impossible challenge, they'll find a way. They'll risk everything to push just a little farther, to see what's on the other side of that horizon. Joe Walker and the 11 other X-15 pilots weren't reckless. They were calculated, precise, and incredibly skilled. But they also understood that progress requires someone to go first. Someone has to be willing to light that rocket engine and point the nose at the stars, not knowing if they'll make it home. Today, we're planning missions to Mars, building commercial spacecraft, talking about permanent bases on the moon. All of that is possible because of programs like the X-15. Because 60 years ago, a handful of pilots proved that humans could survive at the edge of space. The next time you watch a rocket launch or see a spacecraft, re-enter Earth's atmosphere. Remember the X-15. Remember Joe Walker at 354,200 feet, floating in silence, looking down at the curved Earth below. Remember Mike Adams, who paid the ultimate price pushing the boundaries of flight. They flew higher and faster than almost anyone ever has. They did it in a black telephone pole with stubby wings and a rocket engine that could turn them into a shooting star. And they did it because someone had to be first. That's the legacy of the X-15. Not just the speed records or the altitude achievements, but the proof that humans, when pushed to the edge, can accomplish the impossible. And maybe that's the real lesson here. We're capable of so much more than we think. We just need the courage to light the engine and see where it takes us.